Are you ready? Okay, so imagine a circle. We've been singing about circles, so that should be pretty easy. The circle is a symbol of completeness and wholeness. It's a symbol of inclusion and equality. So you have your circle in mind. Now imagine a vertical line running through the center and a horizontal line intersecting it at the center. And your imaginary circle should now be divided into 4 equal quadrants. Y'all have your circle? And for today's purposes, each quadrant represents a spiritual type being an individual's preference for how they engage a spiritual, religious, moral, and ethical life. All this month we've been exploring how it is that we live our values in the world, and the spiritual types tell us that each of us will approach this task a bit differently. And there seems to be a human tendency to create typologies to help us explain and understand ourselves and others. So for example, who here knows your astrological sign? There's 12 of those, right? Your Myers-Briggs type, anybody know that? Your disc type. If you didn't raise your hand, see Gail Spar. And if you're unclear on what any of these are, you might want to seek out someone who had their hand raised after the service and ask them about it. And in case you're wondering, my zodiac sign is Capricorn. I'm an INFJ on the Myers-Briggs and Enneagram 6. Oh, we skipped that. Who knows their Enneagram number? Right, I'm a 6 and an S on the disc. And no one of these provides a completely accurate description of who I am or how I am on any particular day, but they do give me some insights into my preferences, desires, and motivations for how I show up in the world. They are tools for self-discovery and for understanding myself and others on a deeper level. And what we know to be true is that we're all different from each other. And in this space, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which means our differences. We honor difference because we are all different. We engage the world differently. So let's return to that image of the circle divided into 4 quadrants and begin to use it in determining spiritual types, your own, and I'm hoping that we might also get a sense of, does this congregation have a spiritual type, a preference for how you collectively express your spirituality? The spirituality wheel, which is what you've got envisioned in your head, is a tool that was developed by Corrine Ware, who is an author, professor, and pastoral counselor. And she developed the spirituality wheel based on the previous work of the late Urban T. Holmes, an Episcopal priest who also served as dean of the School of Theology at Sewanee, the University of the South here in Tennessee. So that image, the image of the circle divided into 4 quadrants, is the basic structure of the spirituality wheel, which I'll be filling in more detail. But first, I want to do a quick exercise that just might be a little bit of an indicator of each of you and where you think you fit on this spirituality wheel and what your spiritual type may be. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit vulnerable today. So imagine that an injustice has occurred in the community. I know that one isn't too hard to imagine. And today, the horrific injustice in Memphis weighs heavy on our hearts. There's also a lot of injustice in our community and in the world today. Reproductive rights are on the line. The trans community is besieged by bigotry and hatred, entrenched racism, homophobia, gross wealth inequality, and the unequal effects of climate change, to name just a few, all of which affect our local community. But for the purpose of this exercise, choose one that you care about deeply. Does everybody have your one? And now imagine that after the service, not today because we're having a congregational meeting, but on a given Sunday after the service, that we'll be addressing that issue in depth. And after the service, you'll be invited to attend one of 4 events. And you've taken care of all your needs, you had lunch, your children are cared for, so you're sure that you're going to be here. But you have to choose only one. So the first one is a study session exploring what the great thinkers in our tradition have to say about the issue. Another is a vigil and sharing circle with readings, singing, and a time for personal sharing about the issue. Another is a meditation and prayer circle with time for stillness and silence, for grounding and centering, for listening to the voice of conscience within, the voice of wisdom from within and beyond. And then the fourth is an organizing group for planning an action, maybe a protest or letter writing campaign or some other form of direct action. I'll run through these again in just a minute, but first I want to remind all of us that there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to preference. And that's what we're talking about here, is a spiritual preference. So just as some people prefer vanilla ice cream to chocolate, some will be drawn into one activity over the others, be it the study group, learning about the issue by studying the great historical, philosophical, and theological thinkers, the vigil and sharing circle, which is a time for singing and sharing readings and personal experiences, the meditation and prayer group, gathering in stillness, quiet, and silence with the intention of deep listening, or the organizing group for planning and carrying out a direct action to address the issue. So, letting go of any judgments or any real or perceived peer pressure, which one of these calls to you the most? Do you know which one it is yet? By show of hands, if you are willing, and those of you who are on Zoom can type into the chat as you are willing, who would choose the study group? I want you to look around. I want to get a sense of if there's a congregational type too. Yeah, we have maybe about a quarter of the people here present would go to the study group. Who would go to the vigil and sharing group? Maybe, that looks like about a close number. Yeah, maybe about another quarter of the congregation. Or the congregation that's represented here today. Who would choose the meditation and prayer circle? Still a fair number, but not quite as many as the other two. And who would choose the organizing group? A lot of you. I don't know, I think it may be kind of equally balanced between the study group and the organizing group for what looks like the majority, which doesn't surprise me. Does it surprise anybody here? We're often known in the larger community for those two things, intellectual approach to religion and for showing up for social justice in the community. And we need all of the others. And I'm reminded that when Martin Luther King led the marches and all of his civil rights activity, it was grounded in those other three areas. That the people that he called to nonviolent participation in his actions did spiritual work before and after to prepare themselves and then to debrief. So we need all of you. Wherever you raised your hand, you're where you belong. So remember the circle that you first imagined with two lines drawn through it, one vertical and one horizontal intersecting in the middle. The circle itself represents unity and the interdependence of each part upon the other parts. The top of that vertical line represents thinking, and the bottom represents feeling. The right side end of the horizontal line represents what is known or can be revealed, and the left hand side represents what is unknown, what is shrouded in mystery. So each of the quadrants in the circle is bound by two of these four dimensions: thinking, feeling, known, unknown. And each quadrant is associated with a spiritual type. And again, none of these are better or worse. No one is more acceptable than the others. And as I've said, each is needed to make up the whole. And each spiritual type has both its strengths and its weaknesses. So, the top right quadrant, the intellectual or head spirituality, is bound by the dimensions of thinking and knowing. The preference is for rational and analytical thought, for what can be known through observation and measurement, for what can be seen, touched, or vividly imagined. In worship, this spiritual type tends to prefer the written or spoken word, which would be the readings and the sermon, and is likely to closely examine the lyrics of the hymns that we sing. This type is drawn to study as a spiritual practice, delving deeply into sacred texts and what theologians have to say about them. They're interested in real-world matters and accurately describing and naming reality. And it's the intellectual spiritual types who produce theological reflection materials, education materials, and help to bring clarity to thorny ethical issues. So we're grateful for the presence of the intellectual spiritual type among us. But there is a weakness. The weakness of the intellectual or head spirituality is a tendency to rigid rationalism and dry dogmatism. That's why we need the others. So the lower right-hand quadrant, The devotional or heart spirituality is bound by the dimensions of feeling and knowing. It combines the heart with concrete, real-life stuff. There's an interest in shared experience and transformation. This type emphasizes the immanence of divinity over a transcendent understanding of God. And in worship, this type tends to prefer music, personal testimonials, extemporaneous prayers, and embodied ritual. Their preferred spiritual practices tend to be anything that allows for the free expression of feelings, all feelings, including anger, sadness, disappointment, and doubt. The strength of this type is the warmth of feeling, energy, and freedom of expression that they bring. And this type sometimes is viewed as being over-emotional or anti-intellectual. And as a result, the weakness is the tendency of this type towards a sense of pietism, that this is the right way to do it, and it's us against the rest of the world. And this type can have a tendency to be exclusive of other spiritual types and the risk of new thought. So the lower left-hand quadrant of the circle, the mystic spirituality, is bound by the dimensions of feeling and unknowing. In the traditional sense, this spiritual type is more interested in hearing from God rather than speaking to or about God. It's about union with the holy, which can never be fully achieved. It can only be attempted. The mystic spiritual type is more interested in the journey than the destination. And this type tends to be by nature contemplative, introspective, and intuitive. For the mystic, the inner world is just as real as the external world. And people of this spiritual type sometimes have a hard time fitting into our Western Protestant tradition. The gift and strength of the mystic type is what they bring, because what they bring is rich fodder to the theological discourse, and they push the frontiers of spirituality. And the weakness of this type is quietism, a spiritual passivism, and a tendency to withdraw rather than engage with the external world. So finally, the upper left quadrant, the activist spirituality. This one is bound by the dimensions of thinking and unknowing. According to Corinne Ware, who developed the spirituality wheel and has studied each of the spiritual types, says the activist is the smallest group in society. The smallest group in society, but you saw the numbers here among us. And she says that because it's the smallest group in society, it's also the most difficult to describe. And often, people who tend towards activist spirituality aren't all that concerned with organized religion. So there may be a lot more out there that just aren't here with us. They have a mystic bent in that they're concerned with a greater good and the world that can be brought about but does not yet exist. This type of spirituality is also referred to as kingdom or kingdom spirituality. And these are the people who are working to bring about the kingdom of God or the beloved community, bringing it into existence. The activist type is inclined to be assertive and sometimes even crusading, often sacrificing their personal lives for the cause. We have a list of our own martyrs who have sacrificed their lives for the cause of justice. For the activist type, action is their prayer, and worship must include a call to action if it is to be meaningful. The gift and strength of this type is the change that they bring about through their leadership in confronting difficult and sometimes embarrassing issues, the things we would rather not think about or do anything about. The weakness of the activist type is a tendency to judgmentalism and moralism, and the exclusion of those who aren't with them in supporting the cause. So each of these spiritual types brings gifts and strengths as well as weaknesses. And in our journey around that spirituality wheel, you may have recognized something of yourselves in the descriptions. Anybody? Did you recognize your friends? So there's a human tendency to draw our circles close, to include those who are most like us. And I'm just noticing the spiritual type that I think has emerged, which is tendency more to the intellectual and to the activist. So our challenge is not to draw that circle too tight. Because as Unitarian Universalists, we are being called to widen our circle of inclusion, being truly welcoming of people of diverse ethnic, racial, gender, sexual, class, and religious identities. And I'm calling us to expand that circle to include different preferences of spirituality. Because no matter our identity, each of us also brings with us preferred ways of expressing and engaging with our spirituality. It's as the Sufi poet Rumi said, there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Or Francis David, minister of the first established Unitarian church in Transylvania in 1557, said, we need not think alike to love alike. Each of the types on the spirituality wheel is interconnected with all of the others. We need them all for wholeness and unity within ourselves and within our congregations. Each type comes with both strengths and weaknesses. We mitigate the weaknesses and increase our strength when we have the curiosity and the courage to experiment with the spirituality type that moves us out of our comfort zone. Not only does this mean moving out of our preferred mode of being, be that the intellectual, the devotional, the mystic, or the activist, it means welcoming other people into ours, which means being genuinely open to different perspectives, different ways of being, a different way of encountering the divine, however you name it. The call to action today is this, and this is for you activists. The call to action today is this. Actually, it's for everybody. I just know the activists need this. Whatever your spiritual type is, your preference, try moving around the spirituality wheel a bit. If you're an intellectual, hang out with a mystic. And if you're an activist, hang out with a devotional. And just see what happens. And the goal is not to change your style, but to stretch your experience. We need each other to grow in wholeness and completeness, into unity and interconnection. The poet Maya Angelou once wrote, "I came up with one thing, and I don't believe I'm wrong, that nobody, but nobody can make it out here alone." May our circle of connection hold us and sustain us through the days ahead. May the circle be unbroken. Amen, and blessed be.